reading day, and that means we're going to be reading from The Spirits of Christmas, The Darkside of the Holidays. Be back in a minute. Grab your popcorn and snacks. Find a comfy spot, take a seat or lie down, and let me transport you to a place of fantasy, ghost stories, ancient legends, odd creatures, alien encounters, and other magical topics. You may even decide to join the conversation. From faraway lands to your own backyard, with a small dash of pixie dust, turn out the lights and open your minds. The journey is about to begin. Hey everybody, welcome Sunday Reading Day. Spooky stories. Let me get TikTok started here, and we can start rocking through here, okay? Give me a second, and we'll start the intros. Good afternoon, everybody. It's Sunday. What is it? Is it the Sunday after New Year's? I've lost track. I've been so busy. This thing with TikTok disappearing and all. All of us content creators are scrambling to find a place to go, to find new homes for our stuff. Welcome, everybody. It's Sunday Reading Day, and we are still reading The Spirits of Christmas, the dark side of the holidays. We're in the middle of some really cool ghost stories right now. We'll probably be reading this maybe today, maybe next week. We'll see. But when we do stop reading, I'm going to take a poll with you guys. In that, I want to know what you guys want to hear next. Okay, what I've been doing leading up to this book, because we have author permission for this one. What I've been doing leading up to this book is that I've been working off of Gutenberg.com, Gutenberg.org, and those are stuff that's out of copyright. And so we've read Dracula. We've read some classics. We've read about werewolves. We've read Dracula and Frankenstein. And so I'm going to look some books up. Once we finish this book, so you guys can maybe take a choice. We can do a vote on what you guys want read next. Okay. Once we wrap this book up. So it should be fun, to pick a book, long as they're out of copyright. I'm not going to get sued, so that's the important thing, right? Well, welcome everybody. I didn't even introduce myself. I just went right into my spiel, right? My name is Charlotte. I'm going to be your host for the next hour. I'm also the owner. Let me get my notes up. There we go. I got the right. Nope, wrong one. Hang on. Let me get my chat. Still getting used to this stuff here. Stop that. Okay. Where's my chat room? Chat. That must be it down there. There it is. Okay. I'm still getting used to Restream. As you can see, I finally got the California Haunts radio overlay on there. I've got my little ticker thing going. So I'm finally finding my way through here. We've got credits now. We've got intros. Yeah. Anyway, so what's happening here? Welcome, TikTok. We're going to be reading from a paranormal themed book today. These are supposed to be true stories written by my good friend Sylvia Shults. She does a lot of really intensive research on her books. And so we've been reading this through the holidays. We started, I think, the weekend before Thanksgiving reading this, and so we're going to continue today. We're right in the middle of some really cool ghost stories. The next one is Merry Christmas from the Bell Witch, just to give you guys ideas what we're going to be saying. I will not be able to see what your message is or anything over on TikTok. Teeny tiny, not happening. However, I do have some moderators in there, so if you do gift or anything like that, the moderators will thank you and do all that stuff for me. Okay, and if you're mean, the moderators will take care of that too. Okay, thank you, Chris. I see you over there. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited to share this book with you. We do this every Sunday around 5 o'clock. I ran late tonight. I was on a quest for heart medication today. The stores were out, so I had to go through almost 30 miles out of my way to get them. So that's the way it happens now. Anyway, welcome, and I will be reading for about an hour out of this book. We may finish it today. We may not finish it today. We're going to find out. But if we don't, we'll continue next week. And if we do, like I said, I'll pick out some books, and then we'll vote on them. We'll vote on them at the other two networks. We'll vote on them on TikTok to see where we're going to go next with reading books. But this is what we do Sunday. The other thing that's happening is Lynn Monet is going to be part 2 of her interview on Monday, January 20th. And that is going to launch this radio show going back into its 6-day format. Okay, so we're going to start running 6 days a week with the show, and it'll be at 5:30 p.m. Pacific every day except Sunday. Okay, but yeah, we're going to be launching back into our 6-day format with this starting January 20th, which is a Monday. All right. So without further ado, it is 5:13 p.m. right now Pacific. Let's get into this, and I'm going to read for about an hour, and then we'll stop and continue for next week. But yeah, welcome everybody. If you're new here, welcome. Stick around. It's a really good book. It'll give you all the spooky feels. You know, put your fuzzies on, grab some hot cocoa, and let's do this. Let's do this. After I have a sip of water. Okay. So we left off last week, right after the Palatine burned the ship. The Palatine was burning. So the next story is Merry Christmas from the Bell Witch. It's been 200 years since the Bell family of Tennessee was tormented by a mysterious entity known only as the Bell Witch. But the events that unfolded between the years of 1817 and 1821 have remained evergreen in American ghost lore. And they are some of the most amazing tales in Tennessee history. John Bell, a prosperous cotton farmer, was born in North Carolina in 1750. He, his wife Lucy, and their 9 children moved to Robertson County, Tennessee in 1804. Bell purchased many acres of land along the Red River and set about improving it even more. He cleared fields, planted orchards, and built a home for his large family. He even built a one-room schoolhouse where his children and his neighbors' children could get an education. This being Tennessee in the early 19th century, John Bell's cotton plantation was worked by slaves. Okay, here we go. Before we continue with this, okay, we're going to try to stay as politically correct as possible. All right, don't anybody get their pennies in a bunch and turn me into the internet police. Okay, I'm going to try and, if there's negative stuff in here, I don't think she would do that. Sylvia, I don't think does that. But just to give you a heads up, okay, I'm just reading a book. But Bell and his family were very devout, and Bell himself seemed to let his religious beliefs dictate his treatment of his slaves. He doesn't seem to have been a particularly harsh master. John Bell knelt to lead his family in prayers 3 times a day, and he opened his house as a gathering place for prayer meetings, Bible studies led by Lucy Bell, and other worship services. John Bell was socially and politically active as well. He dressed the part of a wealthy, influential businessman and landowner. When he went to town on business, he made an imposing figure in his tailored coat, with silver buttons and his fashionable beaver hat. Bell made many speeches in support of political candidates whose values aligned with his, and he was known for personal integrity and wasn't afraid to speak up for his beliefs. John Bell was an upstanding citizen, a devout Christian, the benevolent head of a large family, a careful steward of his land and property, and a prosperous businessman. That's what made the events to come even more startling. One day in 1817, Bell was inspecting a cornfield when he saw a bizarre-looking animal crouched in the middle of a row of corn. The creature had the body of a dog but the head of a rabbit. Startled and horrified by what he saw, Bell shot at it several times. He didn't hit it, but the strange animal vanished. After this encounter, odd things started to happen in the Bell home. At first, the activity was very subtle. Family members would hear tapping on the windows at night, or rats gnawing on the bedposts, or a sound like an animal scratching at the doors. Nothing could ever be found to account for the noises. Then the noises got violent. The Bell children would be woken up from sleep by the sound of vicious dogfights in their rooms. Other times, they would hear the clank of heavy chains being dragged across the floor, or the racket of furniture being thrown around the room. The weird noises continued for a year. Then, suddenly, things got much worse. The poltergeist activity escalated from noise to physical attacks on the family. The entity started with pulling bedclothes off of sleeping children. An overnight guest was woken by the covers sliding off of him. With a shout, he grabbed the covers, which were bunched up to look like a human form. He found something solid under his hands and yelled in triumph, "I have the ghost!" The fire in the hearth was still burning, and the man jumped out of bed, still holding the bunched up sheets in his hands. He intended to throw the ghost, sheets and all, into the fire and get rid of the tormenting entity forever. But before he got to the fireplace, the room suddenly filled with an overpowering stench. The smell was so bad that the man started to retch. Instinctively, he dropped the wadded sheets and ran out of the room for some fresh air. When he could breathe without heaving, he came back into the room. The nauseating stink was gone, but so was the ghost. Another time, John Bell's son Richard was rudely jerked from a sound sleep by something pulling his hair. Hard. It felt like the top of his scalp was tearing right off. He screamed in agony, and John and Lucy came running into the bedroom. Then an equally ear-splitting shriek came from another bedroom. Betsy, Richard's sister, was being attacked in the exact same way. To add to the physical attacks, the entity had upped its repertoire of sounds. Replacing the animal scratchings and gnawings were a variety of noises that sounded almost human. Lip smacking, throat gulping, and an exquisitely horrifying choking gurgle that sounded like someone being slowly strangled. A family friend, James Johnson, wanted very much to help the Bells with their troubles. He started talking to the ghost, trying to get it to answer questions, to explain its presence in the Bell home. At first, the only response he got was a faint whistling noise. Over the next few days, the air became filled with a feeble whispering that grew in volume until unmistakably there was a voice. By now it was clear that Betsy Bell was increasingly the focus of the entity's attention. The haunting was a great source of stress for her, even more so because at one point, visitors to the home all but accused her of faking the voices using ventriloquism. John and Lucy called in a doctor to debunk this. The phantom voice spoke, and the doctor laid his hand on Betsy's throat. He swore he felt no vibrations from her vocal cords. This convinced him that Betsy was completely innocent of trickery or games. The Bell family and James Johnson peppered the ghost with questions, but the entity refused to give a straight answer. One day it claimed to be a Native American whose bones had been disturbed. Another day it said, "I'm a spirit who was once very happy, but has been disturbed and now I'm unhappy." That did nothing to narrow things down. The most specific answer the entity gave about its identity was that it was Kate Bat, a local woman accused of being a witch. But it wasn't Kate's ghost. Kate Bat was very much alive at the time, although she'd been driven out of the area by an angry mob some time before. The voice became many voices sometimes. Sometimes it was sometimes they stumbled over each other in their clamor to be heard. The voices called themselves the family of Kate Bat, which the Bell family assumed meant that the witch had summoned a host of spirits in a dark ritual. With the arrival of multiple voices came multiple personalities, although the family still referred to the entity as the witch. Not all these personalities were malevolent. The witch had his favorites. On one occasion, the entity saved the life of one of the Bell children. One of the boys was crawling through a cave, near the house. He was navigating a narrow passage when he got stuck in some quicksand. The cave suddenly glowed with an unearthly light, and a disembodied voice shouted, "I'll get you out." Something grabbed the boy's legs. He said later it just felt like some strong hands and pulled him to safety. It was Lucy Bell, John's wife, who was the witch's particular favorite. The ghost sat in on the Bible study groups Lucy led in the Bell home. When the group decided to take a break, fruit would materialize out of thin air, falling into the laps of the stunned guests. Another time, Lucy was very ill and lay sick in bed. The witch cooed, "Luce, poor Luce, how do you feel now?" Then, in a show of affection, it gently showered Lucy's lap with hazelnuts. When Lucy pointed out that the nuts were still in their shells, and she had no way of cracking them, the entity shelled the nuts for her. But other members of the family were victimized by the witch. It seemed to focus much of its malevolence on Betsy Bell. It would pull her hair or slap her face. The attacks would come without warning, and Betsy soon became a shivering, nervous wreck. 16-year-old Betsy was engaged to be married, and the witch would have none of it. When Betsy's fiancé, Joshua Gardner, came to court her, the entity would fill the air with crude talk about the couple, embarrassing poor Betsy to tears. Sometimes, the entity took a gentler tactic. When Betsy lay in bed at night, she would often hear the phantom voice pleading, "Please, Betsy Bell, don't have Joshua Gardner." Eventually, Betsy just gave up and broke off the engagement. The witch saved its most savage ire for John Bell. Early in the haunting, John had been plagued with a weird stiffness in his mouth. He said it felt like someone had jammed a stick in his mouth and was turning it sideways, forcing his jaws apart. Whatever was going on inside John's mouth caused his tongue to swell. He couldn't speak or eat for days at a time. His face would spasm and twitch embarrassingly. Lack of proper nutrition and the sheer strangeness of his suffering took its toll, and John began to fade. By December 1820, he was seriously ill. He was in bed for a week, suffering almost continual torment from the witch. After several days, John seemed to rally a bit, and he felt well enough to go outside for a walk in his garden with his son Richard. But the pair didn't get far. Moments after they stepped outside the house, John's head rocked back with the force of a blow to his face. Stunned, he sat down on a log to catch his breath. His face started convulsing, as if someone was squishing his face and pinching his cheeks without mercy. Then, to add insult to injury, John's shoes fell off. Richard scrambled to grab them and knelt at his father's feet to slip them back on. But every time Richard put the shoes back on, they would yank themselves off again and go flying. The ghost cackled with delighted malice. The old man sat in his garden, with tears of frustration rolling down his face, crying like a kid being tormented by a schoolyard bully. On the morning of December 20th, John Bell fell into a coma. Thinking to rouse his father, John Jr. went to the cabinet to fetch the medicine the family doctor had prescribed. It was gone. In its place in the cupboard was a strange flask, about one-third of a dark, evil-looking syrup. In a panic, John Jr. sent a servant to fetch the doctor. The voice of the witch rose up in a cackle, filling the room with the sound of its triumph. I put it there, and gave old Jack a big dose of it last night, while he was fast asleep. I guess that fixed him, the witch bragged. The doctor arrived and inspected the suspicious-looking liquid. He decided to test it on the family cat. The cat licked a little bit off of a spoon. Then it leaped into the air, whirled around 3 times, and dropped to the floor, unalive. Instead of handing the mysterious flask over to the sheriff, as he should have done, the doctor poured the rest of the flask's dark contents into the fire, where it could do no more harm. By doing so, though, he destroyed any evidence that could have helped identify Bell's murderer. Had Bell been poisoned by someone very, very much of this world? But the harm was already done. The next morning, John Bell succumbed to the mysterious poison and slipped into death. The witch didn't even let the family hold John's funeral in peace. It interrupted the service with shrieks of glee and a crude drinking song. Christmas in the Bell house was a somber affair that year, but the witch was ecstatic. On Christmas Day, the family was rudely awakened by the raucous voice of the witch, shouting carols at high volume and cackling maniacally. The family hadn't planned any celebration, but they did decide to have a low-key exchange of presents. When they came downstairs, though, they found shredded wrapping paper all over the room. The presents were destroyed. Betsy Bell lived into her 80s. To the end of her life, she swore that the most horrendous episode of her life was the haunting, and that she would always remember 1820 as the year Satan stole my father, and Christmas and Jesus went with us. Okay. Next one is the murder of Thelma Todd. I've known and respected your husband for many years, and what's good enough for him is good enough for me, Groucho Marx in Monkey Business. Hollywood. Bright lights, movie stars, fame so close you can taste it. The glamour of the movie business has lured many eager souls to California. Some hopefuls become stars, some stars become legends, and some stars burn brightly and then explode, victims of their own incandescence. Thelma Todd was born July 29, 1906, in Lawrence, Massachusetts. She was a bright little girl, a good student who had dreams of becoming a schoolteacher. After graduating high school in 23, she enrolled at the Lowell Normal School to work towards a teaching degree. But life and Thelma's mother had other plans. Seeing Thelma's fresh blonde beauty, Mrs. Todd encouraged her daughter to start entering beauty contests. Thelma did well in local pageants and even won Miss Massachusetts in 1925. Sorry, I should have flowed that better. The prestigious win sent her on to the Miss America pageant, but she didn't win. But there were talent scouts in the audience who were looking for fresh new faces for the young film industry. Thelma was invited to seek her fortune in Hollywood, which was just what Mrs. Todd had wanted all along. Thelma proved to be a natural on the screen. The 1920s were a heady time for the film industry. Hollywood was making the transition from silent movies to talkies. Some actors and actresses just couldn't make the leap, mostly because their voices didn't match their appearance. Thelma started her career in silent movies and played numerous supporting roles that showcased her beauty but gave her little chance to act. That changed with the coming of sound to movies. Thelma blossomed in the talkies. Thelma's voice, a bright, clear soprano with just a trace of northeastern lilt, matched her image beautifully. She had enough of a New England accent to sound aristocratic without coming off as snobby. Acting roles poured in for Thelma. In the Chicago Tribune article written in 1991, she was described 1991. Okay. She was described as a cross between Goldie Hawn and Farrah Fawcett. Okay. Only more popular. She played all kinds of roles, including parts in dramas and gothic horror films. But it was as a comedic actress that Thelma really shone. She made 115 pictures between 1926 and 1935. Producer Hal Roach paired her with Laurel and Hardy and led her to other studios where she made films with Buster Keaton and the Marx Brothers, including Horse Feathers and Monkey Business. Stan Laurel was a particular friend of Thelma's, and he often requested that she be cast as a leading lady in his films. Thelma picked up a couple of nicknames in the business. She was known as Hot Toddy or the Ice Cream Blonde. But Thelma's life wasn't all ice cream and belly laughs. She married Pat Tisico in 1932 and divorced him in 1934. Even before that, in 1931, she had started an affair with director Roland West. Soon, she and West were living together, sharing a house with West's ex-wife. That must have been nice. The phrase, "it's complicated," is particularly apt here. And that wasn't the worst of it. When Thelma started working with Hal Roach, the producer made her sign a contract that included something he laughingly called the potato clause. But it was no laughing matter. The potato clause said that if Thelma gained over 5 pounds, she'd be fired. This had the potential to seriously damage her career. Sucked into the lavish Hollywood lifestyle, Thelma went to a lot of parties and did a lot of drinking, filling up on empty calories. Her mother worried that Thelma would jeopardize her meal ticket. Helpfully, who worried that she would jeopardize her meal ticket helpfully introduced her daughter to diet pills. With her movie earnings, Thelma bought a restaurant in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Pacific Palisades. How significant is this, you guys? Tourists, as well as Hollywood royalty, flocked to the popular restaurant called Thelma Todd's Sidewalk Cafe. The second floor of the building was a nightclub called Joyous, and the third floor was an issue. The riches of Los Angeles had attracted the attention of the mafia. The mobster, Lucky Luciano, had dreams of setting up an empire of prostitution, gambling, and extortion in L.A. He introduced himself to Thelma and started to make himself indispensable to the young actress. He got her hooked on potent amphetamines that kept the weight off better than her prescription diet pills. Thelma was intrigued by the air of rakish danger Lucky Luciano represented. Mobsters were rich, with their own brand of glamour, but even though she herself was a movie star, there was still a part of Thelma that tried to keep her New England schoolteacher innocence. Thelma Todd's Sidewalk Cafe and Joyous were intensely important to the young star. The restaurant and club were the first things Thelma owned that were really truly hers, and they were wildly successful. Visiting Thelma Todd's Sidewalk Cafe in the 30s was like dining at Spago's today. It was a place to see and be seen. Thelma was protective of her investments. So when Lucky Luciano approached Thelma with a proposition, he wanted that he wanted to rent the third floor of her building above Joya's and turn it into a gambling parlor, Thelma was appalled. She didn't care that Luciano was one of the biggest names in gangland. She channeled the gutsy, wisecracking heroines she played on the silver screen, and she told Luciano to go get stuffed. Another man with a compelling interest in Thelma Todd's Sadboat Cafe was Thelma's boyfriend, Roland West. West wanted Thelma at the restaurant, drawing customers in with her star power, more than she wanted to be there. West called Thelma his money magnet, with rough affection. He told her, "You're my money maker. If you're not there, I'm not making money." On the night of December 14th, Thelma went to a gala Hollywood party thrown by her friend Stanley Lupino and his daughter actress Ida Lupino. Unfortunately, one of the other guests at the party was Pat DeCicco, Thelma's ex-husband. When he heard Thelma was going to be there, he apparently requested to be seated next to her at dinner. This obviously was not someone Thelma wanted to party with. Thelma threw back a few drinks, and she and DeCicco argued. Thelma was also in the doghouse with her boyfriend, Roland West. Theater owner Sid Grauman called West as the evening wound down, saying that Thelma was headed home and was a bit under the influence. Grauman tactfully suggested that perhaps West might want to pour Thelma into bed when she got home. But Thelma never made it home. Sometime in the wee hours of Monday morning, December 16th, 1935, Thelma Todd died in the garage of West's house. She was found by her maid, May Whitehead, slumped in the front seat of her Lincoln Phaeton. The official cause was carbon monoxide poisoning, resulting from sitting in an enclosed garage with the car's engine running. But this doesn't explain the injuries Thelma suffered immediately before her death. A split lip, a broken nose, several broken ribs, and bruises. Besides that, she'd been hit in the mouth hard enough to dislodge one of her dental fillings. She'd made an enemy, but who? Was it Roland West, who had locked her out of their apartment that chilly December night? Was it Pat DeCicco, who had ties with the mob? Could it have been Lucky Luciano? According to one story, when Luciano brought up the idea of putting in a gambling den on the third floor of Thelma's building over dinner one night, Thelma snarled at him, "Over my dead body." If the story is to be believed, Luciano melodramatically replied, "That can be arranged." Whether Thelma's death was accident or suicide or murder, it shocked the acting world. The sassy, beloved comedian, not yet 30 years old, was gone. On the morning Thelma's body was discovered, the day's mail delivery brought her Christmas card to stand in Ruth Laurel's home. The trunk of Thelma's car was full of Christmas presents for her friends and family. On December 23rd, 1935, she was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Cemetery. Crowds gathered to pay their respects to the actress who lay in a casket covered with mounds of yellow roses. Thelma was gone, but her spirit still wanders the hills of Hollywood. Her ghost has been seen near the restaurant that bore her name. Even in death, she is still glamorous, still dressed in the evening gown, mink coat, and jewels she wore to her last party. Sometimes she appears on the staircase of the building where she and Roland West lived, and in the garage where she was found dead. Witnesses have heard a car running and have smelled the sharp tang of gasoline. The garage hasn't been used to store cars in decades. Strange happenings at the Todd House. The oldest private home in Victoria, British Columbia, is a small bungalow on Huron Street. The wooden frame house was built in 1851 by John Todd. Hi, Pamela. Head trader for the Hudson Bay Company. John Todd was quite the frontier character. He immigrated from Scotland in 1813 to seek his fortune in New Caledonia, as that part of British Columbia was then known. He certainly made the most of the freedom from most of the freedom the Canadian frontier offered. At one point, he ran afoul of the governor of the Hudson Bay Company and was banished to the remote outpost of Fort Macleod. He spent 9 years there and used the time to become fluent in several Native American dialects. One anecdote in particular reveals Todd's rough and tumble, take-no-crap attitude. In 1847, he was chief trader at Fort Kamloops when Chief Nicola and his men showed up to attack the fort. Todd showed the chief a keg of gunpowder and threatened to blow himself and the fort sky high if the Kamloops tribe didn't leave the fort in peace. The bluff worked, and Chief Nicola backed down. John Todd was married at least 7 times. 4 of those marriages were to Native American women. Apparently his business acumen, Native women. Apparently his business acumen was not the only asset that was improved by his fluency in native dialects. Todd's multiple marriages produced 10 children. Wanting to keep his growing family safe, Todd made his small home into a fortress. The home was built with a defense in mind. The thick wooden front door still graces the house, complete with a bullet hole, said to be from an attack by rival traders from Cadborough Bay. There's also a tunnel that runs from the cellar to a spot some ways from the house, a bolt hole the family could use to escape in the event of an attack. Todd's colorful life ended in 1882, and the house was passed down to his heirs. Colonel and Mrs. T.C. Evans bought the house in 1944. What they didn't know was that their new home had already become the focus of supernatural attention. Mrs. E.C. Turner lived in the Todd house with her daughter from 1929 to 1944. She spoke of experiencing eerie feelings in a large upstairs bedroom. Neither she nor her daughter would sleep in that room. The cat, too, would growl and arch her back when she passed the room, as if she could see something. Mrs. Turner couldn't. Colonel and Mrs. Evans didn't believe in ghosts. Nonetheless, he couldn't deny that the house was extremely odd. The cellar door refused to stay closed, even when it was locked. Hats from the hat stand would often be found tossed around the hallway, and Mrs. Evans's antique rocker would often rock by itself in the living room. The colonel did some research on the history of the house. The rumor he'd heard was that one of John Todd's native wives had gone insane and was kept chained in an upstairs bedroom. Colonel and Mrs. Evans regularly opened their home to servicemen during World War II. One night, 2 airmen spent the night at the Todd house. The colonel and his wife, despite their skepticism, couldn't deny that the large bedroom on the upper floor gave them the creeps. So they turned it into the guest room and settled the 2 servicemen, aviators, in for the night. The next morning, Mrs. Evans found the room empty. The 2 men came back later that day in the daylight to explain their hurried departure. One man was quoted in an interview, printed in the Vancouver Sun. Here we go. We'd been asleep for several hours when I suddenly awoke. I can't really describe what woke me, although it sounded like the rattling of chains. Over in the corner stood an Indian woman, see what I mean? A native woman. Her hands held out to me in such a manner that she seemed to be pleading with me to help her. On her arms and legs were what looked like fetters. She kept looking at me, her hands outstretched and saying something that I couldn't quite catch. As suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. I'll never forget the sight. The spirits of Todd House seemed to be the most active during the holiday season. One morning, the Evanses awoke to find that the Christmas decorations had all been stripped from the walls and the tree, and that the Christmas cards had been swept from the mantel. Everything was all in a pile in the middle of the floor. The ghost even showed up for a New Year's party. Mrs. Evans had hung a porcelain cookie jar from a hook near the fireplace. During the party, the cookie jar started to swing back and forth, in full view of the astonished guests. The jar swung itself for nearly half an hour, as the guests watched in amazement. After the New Year's Eve party, the Todd house became famous as a haunted location. The swinging cookie jar was such a sensation that word about the hauntings in the house got out. Reporters showed up to investigate, and curiosity seekers showed up to gawk. In early 1947, Colonel Evans began to work on installing a new oil furnace. Workmen were digging a hole next to the front porch for the oil storage tank. About 7 feet down, they uncovered a human skeleton. The workmen refused to dig any further, so Colonel Evans excavated the bones himself. The skull was in good shape, but the bones had largely decomposed, and the colonel figured that the body had been covered with quicklime at the time it was buried. A forensic specialist determined that the bones were those of a female, of either Asian or Native American descent. and that the woman had been buried over 50 years earlier, making her date of death summer before 1897. John Todd died in 1882. Strangely enough, once the bones had been unearthed, the hauntings at the Todd house stopped. Okay. Next, Professor Gladstone and the murderer. The small town of Beachy, Saskatchewan, didn't see much excitement during the year. But the evening of December 10th, 1932, was a special occasion. That night, people were braving the wintry weather and flocking to the small movie theater in town. They weren't coming to see Betty Davis or Gary Cooper, or the antics of the Marx Brothers or the snide sarcasm of W.C. Fields. They were there to see a live performance by Professor Gladstone, mentalist, a real live mind reader, or so he claimed. The house lights dimmed, and the audience settled in for an evening of exciting entertainment. They had no idea of how much drama would shortly come from that small stage. Professor Gladstone was tall, with a distinguished manner, well befitting a mind reader, and showman. He put on a memorable performance as he worked the show for nearly an hour, astounding the audience with his uncanny powers of mentalism. Unbeknownst to the audience, the show was about to get a lot more interesting. Gladstone stopped his dramatic pacing around the stage and went eerily still for a few long moments. The audience began to murmur their uncertainty. What was wrong? Then Gladstone snapped to attention and stared out over the audience. He locked eyes with a local rancher named Bill Taylor. At this moment, you're thinking of your friend Scotty McLaughlin, Gladstone intoned. As Taylor blinked in astonishment, the mind reader added, Scotty McLaughlin was the victim of a foul, brutal murder. A ripple of shock rustled through the theater. 3 years before, McLaughlin had farmed in the area with a partner, John Schumacher. He had plans to sell his share of the farm to Schumacher and move to British Columbia. He had intended to take the night train out of town on January 16, 1930. His friends had showed up at the station to see him off and wish him luck, but McLaughlin had never arrived to catch his train. The police had been notified, but the investigation had long gone cold. Professor Gladstone wasn't finished making electrifying announcements. He pointed to another man in the audience and announced, He will find the body, and I myself will be with him when he does. It was another bombshell. The man Gladstone had pointed to was Constable Carey, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Officer for the town. Constable Carey was himself shocked at Gladstone's revelations. The next morning, he called RCMP headquarters in Saskatoon. He told Corporal Jack Woods about the previous night's astounding scene at the theater. Woods did a quick background check on Professor Gladstone and decided to reopen the case. Whether one believed in mind-reading powers or not, Gladstone's act had reminded the community that one of their citizens had been missing for nearly 3 years. If nothing else, the police would do well to take advantage of the renewed interest in the situation. When Corporal Woods arrived, Constable Carey contacted Professor Gladstone, and the three men began to canvass the town of Beachy and the outlying farming community. They spent the entire day talking to people, mostly getting a rehash of the same dead-end information that Carey had heard in January of 1930. But they caught a break in the case. A farmer who was impressed by Gladstone's talents admitted that before McLaughlin had gone missing, John Schumacher had come to see him in a towering rage. The farmer had no idea why Schumacher was so worked up, but he did say that Schumacher had threatened to kill the darned Scotsman. This new evidence was enough to send the policeman, with Gladstone in tow, out to Schumacher's farm that same night. As the tires of the car crunched on Schumacher's driveway, Gladstone insisted that McLaughlin's body was somewhere on that property. John Schumacher, however, stuck to the story he told when McLaughlin had gone missing. He kept the story simple. Scotty had wanted to leave for British Columbia, so he, Schumacher, had paid Scotty a few $100s for his share of the land. He had never seen Scotty again, and had no idea where he was now. The Mounties found Schumacher's story a little too pat and started asking more questions. Schumacher, sensing their suspicions, clammed up. Just as the police were about to give up in frustration, Professor Gladstone spoke. He painted a sordid picture of the crime. Scotty had indeed come to Schumacher seeking payment for his share of the farm, but Schumacher had started a fight. The two men had wandered, still arguing, close to the barn. The argument had turned violent. A blow fell, and another, and another. Schumacher had buried McLaughlin's body near the barn. John Schumacher's stubborn silence said more than a desperate denial ever could. The next morning, the police officers and Gladstone returned, and they brought a group of other men from the community. The men were all carrying picks and shovels. The group looked to Professor Gladstone for instructions. The mind reader concentrated fiercely for a few brief moments. Then he pointed, that was my stomach, I'm sorry you guys. Then he pointed to a frozen pile of manure. Dig there, you'll find him. 2 hours later, the men's hands were beginning to go numb with the cold. John Schumacher stood nearby, still saying nothing. The group was still working, but they weren't digging with the same vigor as when they'd started. Could the professor have been wrong this whole time? Suddenly, a shovel edge scraped against not hard, frozen dirt, but something more yielding. A woolen sock. There was something in the ground. Soon, the diggers had unearthed an entire skeleton. Shreds of a rotting cloth lay limply on the bones. The men fell silent. That scarf, it's Scotty's, one man said in a sick, strangled voice. The skull, when pried from the frozen grave and brushed off, showed 3 distinct fractures. John Schumacher broke down and admitted to the murder. He was convicted and sentenced, and justice was finally served. The case brought Professor Gladstone to the kind of publicity money just can't buy. His career flourished, and he continued to perform for many years. As good as he was, though, he never had another show as dramatic as the one he played in Beachy, Saskatchewan on December 10th, 1932. You might recognize this one. It is the McKay haunting. Okay, making sure everybody can hear me. Constant readers and other fans of the paranormal may remember the case of the 2 English ladies who visited Versailles in 1904 and had the eerie experience of seeming to travel back in time to the era of the French Revolution. A Mr. William McKay had a similar experience in Ireland around 1852. McKay was out hunting waterfowl with his dog sometime towards the beginning of December. It was a bitterly cold night, and the moon had already set. The young man had enjoyed his long day of sport and was just about to head for home when he heard the unfamiliar bark of a strange dog. Then he heard a musket shot. Then he heard a barrage of shots, which he could identify as attack and defense. McKay, although he couldn't see the shooters, still didn't think the gunshots were anything of a paranormal nature. Then he noticed that his courageous hunting dog was crouching in a terrified huddle, trying to crawl between McKay's feet for protection. Faced with his dog's uncharacteristic behavior, McKay started to wonder what exactly was going on around him in the darkness of the marshes. Suddenly, a few hundred yards away, he saw a glow like a house fire. McKay knew the marshes well, and he knew that not only wasn't there a house there, but there wasn't really anything that combustible either. And yet, pieces of burning roof and thatch and timber sparks were falling into the water at his feet with tiny hisses as they extinguished themselves. And still, the gunshots continued. They seemed to lessen a bit as the glow of the fire rose. Then the clear note of a bugle sounded, piercing the cold night air. The gunfire stopped, and McKay heard the clop and jingle of a cavalry squad trotting towards the scene of the fire. McKay stood still for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, The sound of horses going at a walk as they left the scene faded away into the distance. The phantom glow of the fire had appeared along the path McKay normally would have taken to get home. But he was so terrified that he skirted that area of the marsh and took a longer way home. At breakfast the next morning, the young McKay caught Mary hell from his father for staying out so late. McKay thought quickly and came up with a plausible excuse. Or so he thought. He explained that while out hunting, he had fallen asleep for a while. He spun the weirdness he'd seen and heard the barking dog. The gunshots, first the one, and then a barrage of gunfire. The glow of the fire, the bits of burning thatch, and chunks of glowing timber. The horses riding up, then riding away, into a dream. McKay's father gave a knowing snort when his son had finished spitting that white lie. If that's the case, boy, you were dreaming with your eyes open. The father went on to explain that young McKay was not the only person ever to witness the strange series of events. Then, the father told his son a family story that had taken place over 150 years ago. Near the end of the 17th century, a widow named Sally McKay lived with her 3 sons on the outer edge of the small McKay settlement. The sons had somehow run afoul of the authorities, and all 3 were accused of high treason. A warrant was issued for their arrest and delivered to the officer in command of the infantry regiment stationed in the nearby town of Lifford. High treason was a serious offense, so a company of troops was gathered immediately and set off at 11 p.m. There was a simple, narrow bridle path that led from the main road to the McKay's cottage, so the military could only approach in single file. The company arrived at the cottage at midnight and made their way up the narrow path. So quietly did the troops move that the first inkling Sally and her friends had that something was amiss was that their collie dog started barking. There was a single gunshot, and yelp, then silence. Someone had shot their dog. Unalived their dog. Okay. Sadly, Sally and her sons raced to the windows. In one glance, they took in the sight of the dead guard dog, and the soldiers fanning out to encircle the cottage. Sally grabbed a musket from the stack they kept handy and started to shoot, handing the guns off to her sons to reload when she ran dry. Several soldiers dropped to the ground, either wounded or killed. Sally McKay was a good shot. No one ever found out if the fire that destroyed the cottage started by accident. As the fire grew, looking at the timber walls and devouring the thatched roof, Sally stopped shooting, overcome by the smoke and flames. She heaved the door open, gasping for fresh air, then collapsed still inside the burning cottage. The officer in command rushed in, braving smoke and falling, burning timbers, and scooped Sally up. He carried her a safe distance from the inferno. Sally was wounded and burned. All 3 of her sons were dead, but the soldiers sent to arrest them had gotten the worst of the fight. Many of them were killed and wounded. The sentries in Lifford heard the exchange of gunfire. They sent on a cavalry troop to see what was going on out in the marshes. The troop got there just in time to see the infantry officer drag Sally from the burning cottage. The cavalry milled around for a while, then left as the action was over. Sally McKay was not fatally wounded in the fight, or the fire. Although she'd lost all 3 of her sons and her home, she was down but not out. She made a full recovery and lived for many years afterwards. She survived to a good old age and delighted in telling the people about the firefight in which she'd held off a troop of government soldiers. The Dug Hill Booger. It's B-O-O-G-E-R, okay? Kind of funny. The Dug Hill Booger. Every state in the Union can lay claim to its own treasure trove of ghost stories, but Illinois seems to have more than its share of terrifying tales. Of course, you can't swing a dead cat in Chicago and the suburbs without smacking a ghost. But the southern tip of Illinois, The area known as Little Egypt is also rich in ghost lore. In contrast to the urban bustle of Chicago and the suburbs in the northern part of the state, southern Illinois is quiet. Some would almost say comatose. Southern Illinois is a region that has more in common with its Kentucky and Tennessee neighbors to the south than its big sister Chicago to the north. Southern Illinois is a place of mystery and tall tales. Take Doug Hill, for example. This is a spot about 5 miles west of Jonesboro on State Highway 126. The road here was cut through the bedrock of this part of the state to make an easier passage from the Mississippi River to the interior of southern Illinois. Doug Hill Road is a secluded spot, dark and spooky. It's not quite so terrifying nowadays, in the era of Netflix and McDonald's and Facebook. But this area was once considered one of the most dangerous and most haunted places in southern Illinois. Reports of ambush, robbery, and violence were common, but there was a supernatural element to Doug Hill's reputation as well. Legend says that it was haunted because of an incident that took place during the waning days of the Civil War. In April 1865, a provost marshal named Welch was working in the area. One day, he arrested 3 deserters from the Union Army and turned them into the authorities in Jonesboro. He was doing his duty, but word came a few days later that General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war had ended, so the deserters were released. But the men were still seething over being arrested. They wanted revenge on Provost Marshal Welch. Late that night, Welch was riding home, passing through Doug Hill on his way. The deserters had set up an ambush along the road. They shot Welch down in cold blood and left his body lying on the road. Even though the body was discovered after only a short time, no one was ever arrested for the murder. Perhaps because the murderers weren't punished by any earthly court, Welch's ghost soon began to appear on the Doug Hill Road, searching for its own brand of justice. Some people saw the ghost walking along the road, dressed in bloody clothes, begging for help from a passing wagon or passing wagon drivers. Most often, though, the ghost just appeared as a figure lying in the middle of the road, where Welch's earthly body had fallen. Troy Taylor writes of the Doug Hill ghost in his book, The Big Book of Illinois Ghost Stories. Quote, according to one account, a wagon driver was passing along Doug Hill Road one evening when he saw the body of a man lying face down in the center of the road. He stopped his horses and climbed down to see if he could help. When he leaned down to try and turn the man over, his hands passed right through him. The teamster tried again to lift the body, and again he only touched the dirt beneath it. Terrified, he ran back to his wagon. Cracking the whip, he drove the wagon forward and felt a distinct thump of the wheels passing over the spectral corpse. He looked back once and saw that the body had vanished. The unfortunate Welch was not the only spook that lurked on Doug Hill Road. A spectral wagon also terrorized that stretch of road. One night, in late December, a farmer named Bill Smith was driving along the road after dark. The ground was frozen hard, and the muddy ruts were chunks of iron in the path. Any wagon driven at a speed faster than a horse could walk would rattle and shake as it jounced over the frozen ground. The bouncing of Smith's wagon worked the yoke loose on his horse's shoulders, so he had to stop to tighten it. Smith brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down from his seat to replace the horse's yoke. He blew on his cold fingers as he worked the stiff leather. He heard the rumble of another wagon approaching, and it was coming fast, much too fast, on a dark road with woods on both sides. There was little room on the narrow trail to pass. Smith knew that if he couldn't get out of the way, or at least warn him that he was stopped in the middle of the road, they'd both end up killed. Smith shouted a warning into the darkness as loud as he could, but the thunder of the runaway wagon filled the air, and it seemed impossible that the other driver could even hear him. Smith suddenly realized that the unearthly racket was much closer to him, filling his ears with the pounding of the horse's hoofs and the clatter of a wooden wagon about to shake itself to splinters. Smith saw a pair of huge black horses, snorting foam as they thundered along the road, pulling a wagon with its sideboards rattling with the stress of the ride. The driver sat at the box, cracking the whip and urging the horses on with slaps of the reins. But Smith couldn't see his face in the darkness. The wagon crested the hill, heading straight for Smith, and then it kept arcing up on that trajectory, sailing right into the air above Smith's head. The horses were running, and the wheels were turning, as if the wagon was traveling on solid ground rather than thin air. The wagon gained the road again at the crest of the next hill. It had barreled over the dip in the road as if it was flat ground. Smith rose from where he crouched in terror and soothed his panicked horse. He stared down the road as he thumped the horse's shoulders in stunned amazement. He couldn't see the phantom wagon anymore, but he could still hear it, and the monstrous thing was 2 miles away at that point. Smith decided it would be a long, long time before he traveled the Dughill Road after dark again. The old Royal Ascot Hotel. It's unfortunate, but sometimes beautiful old buildings are demolished in the name of progress. Such was the case of the old Royal Ascot Hotel in England. The hotel stood near a racetrack in Berkshire, west of London. Guests of the high-class establishment were treated with white-glove respect. The livery service from the train station to the hotel was an immaculate coach and pair. Gentlemen in stylish coats, and ladies in dresses and hats of the very latest fashion pored over the race list in the elegant hotel lobby, or enjoyed delicacies in the dining room. But all good things come to an end, and the old Royal Ascot Hotel was put up for auction in the spring of 1964. By the end of the year, the once grand hotel was slated for destruction. Demolition men moved into the building to prepare it for its date with the wrecking ball. The workers arranged temporary sleeping quarters in some of the 40 rooms of the hotel. But they hadn't been there long when some of the men began to mutter about strange goings on in the aging building. Shortly after Christmas, the old night watchman quit in a hurry. He walked off the job one night without even stopping to collect the 2 or 3 days' pay that was owed him. When his supervisor finally got in contact with him, the old man swore he had heard ghostly footsteps in the hotel's hallways. But that wasn't why he had left so abruptly. It was the sight of a ghostly horse whinnying and stamping late at night in one of the hotel room doorways that proved to be too much for him. After the night watchman walked off the job, other workmen began to come forward with their own experiences. According to witnesses, the phantom horse was ghostly pale, either white or gray. The men spoke of hearing the spectral horse stamping and snorting in the empty corridors of the derelict hotel. One worker, Thomas Murphy, claimed he'd seen the phantom horse standing under an arch in the hotel. Another man, Pat Bradshaw, had taken over the night watchman's job. He heard the eerie snorts of an invisible horse, which, he said, made his hair stand on end. Eventually, only 6 men of the crew were left that were willing to sleep in the hotel. The others were just too spooked. It wasn't only the ghost of the horse that had the men leaving in droves. One night, as the men came back to the hotel after a day's work, they found themselves unable to open a door which had been left open only minutes before. Other residents had a theory for the ghost horse's origin. When the old Royal Ascot Hotel was being built, horses were used to drag sledges loaded with bricks from the kilns to the building site. One of the horses had collapsed from overwork, and sadly, it had to be put down. Maybe, the old-timers theorized, after working so hard to help put up that hotel, the horse had returned to haunt the men who were now pulling it down. Okay. Let me have a quick sip of drink here. And the aircraft carrier Glory is the next one up. Okay. A few days after Christmas, 1955, a Mr. Harry Meyerthal was working as a painter at Ross's dockyard in Fife, Scotland. Early that morning, he showed up to work on the aircraft carrier Glory, which was in the dockyard for renovation. Meyerthal had an early breakfast in the dining hall, then went aboard the ship. He kept his work clothes in cabin 8 on the galley deck, so that was where he headed first. Outside the cabin was a locker where he kept a lamp needed for work. This was a double lamp that could light both the cabin and the corridor, so it had a thick electrical cord attached to it. Meyerthal opened the door to cabin 8 and stepped inside to plug in the cable. When Meyerthal switched on the light, he saw a man standing near the door of the cabin, by the dressing table. The man was quite tall, about 5 feet 9 inches, and he was dressed in flying gear suitable for tropic conditions. Blue shorts and a leather flying jacket with a fur collar. The jacket hanging open. On the right-hand side of the jacket, a row of small bombs was painted in red, and a pair of pilot's wings were pinned on the left-hand side. The man wore a flying helmet pushed up on the back of his head, with a shock of blonde hair sticking out from under the front of the helmet. On the right side of the man's neck was a long red puckered scar. Meyerthal stared at the man for a moment before realizing he was probably one of the maintenance staff, part of a skeleton crew stationed aboard the carrier while it was docked for repairs. Meyerthal said, "Good morning. Did you enjoy your Christmas?" But the man made no reply to the cheerful greeting. Meyerthal shrugged and stepped out of the cabin to get a leather jacket from his work locker. Suddenly he stopped, frowning. What was the man doing in cabin 8, dressed in full flight gear so early in the morning? He poked his head back into the cabin to ask the aviator who he was. The room was empty. Meyerthal grabbed the double lamp and flooded the cabin with light. There was only a bunk bed, the dressing room table, and a small locker, which was closed. There was no sign of the aviator. Meyerthal dropped the lamp and tore down the hallway shrieking. A workmate stopped him in his headlong flight down the stairs. He calmed Meyerthal down, and together the two went back to investigate the cabin. They found no one in the room. When the naval commander came aboard, both men told him about the strange apparition. The officer, too, searched the cabin and the corridor. He found no sign of the flyer with the scarred neck. This was just too much for Meyerthal. He slumped into a chair in a state of shock and had to be escorted off the ship. Rumor spread, and soon the story was making the rounds of the dockyard. Workmen said the phantom was the ghost of an officer who was killed in a crash landing on the deck of the Glory after returning from a flight over Korea shortly before Christmas during the Korean War. The spectral airman had appeared before. The stories insisted. The ghost always showed up in cabin 8, his old quarters, just after Christmas. There was, however, a flaw in this spook story. It's true that 25 of the men serving aboard the Glory had lost their lives in combat, but none of them had died as a result of crash landing on the aircraft carrier's deck. Furthermore, no RAF officer had ever served on that particular ship, so the identity of the scarred ghost of the Glory was a complete mystery, and so it remains. All right, guys, one more, and then that's going to do it for today. And we will continue next week. Like I said, don't know how far we have to go, but we will continue. Number 149 Squadron. Late 1939, in the early days of the air war in World War II, was a time of uncertainty for the Royal Air Force. The German Luftwaffe was strong and aggressive, striking fear into the hearts of civilians on the ground and causing tension in the ranks of the RAF. The RAF hadn't yet built up its strength in either pilots or aircraft. Much of the air fighting in 1939 consisted of attacks of limited strength and effectiveness as the RAF tested itself against the Luftwaffe. Those feints and jabs were still lethal, although, okay, many planes were lost, and many pilots died as the RAF struggled to find its footing in the skies. One of the main forces at the time operated out of Mindenhall, based in Suffolk, England. Pilots of Number 149 Squadron flew 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 flew, flew, flew Vickers Wellington bombers. Sorry about that. Unfortunately, Wellingtons were huge, bulky monsters without much firepower. The British were still sending their bombers out in daylight, and the German fighter planes were tearing them apart. There were very few British fighters available to provide an escort for the vulnerable bombers. Radio silence was of paramount importance, so when the bombers left, the ground crew at Mindenhall had nothing to do but wait until the planes returned, or failed to return. The missions were timed so that the Wellingtons took off in daylight, made their bombing runs, then ran for home as darkness fell. On December 18th, 1939, coming up on the shortest day of the year, there wasn't much daylight to work with. To guide the bombers to safety, the ground crews lined the runway with cans of paraffin placed in parallel lines, giving the pilots a place to aim. When the bomber was close enough to begin its descent, the ground crews lit a chance light, which illuminated the runway with a bright yellow beam. 9 Vickers Wellingtons had taken off from Mindenhall earlier that day. 2 of them developed mechanical failures and limped home without having had the chance to drop their payload. The 7 bombers still out were flying in wretched conditions. There was heavy cloud cover, snow had begun to fall, and the temperature dropped to well below freezing. One plane straggled in just past 5 p.m., followed by 2 more. That left 4 bombers, unaccounted for in the growing winter darkness. The snow came down more heavily as the clock ticked. The late afternoon gloom faded to full night. The bombers were now more than an hour overdue. The ground crews set up the paraffin flares and the chance light, even though they had the sinking feeling the planes were all down. The men watched nervously, stamping booted feet and blowing on cold fingers. Half an hour passed, then an officer lifted his head, listening hard. A sound was approaching in the hush of the falling snow. The other men perked up. A plane was definitely on its way to Mindenhall. But something was wrong. Instead of the smooth drone of the Vickers' two powerful engines, they heard a choppy, choking sound, choking cough. The bomber was in serious distress. The mechanics on the ground were men who knew their engines. They could tell immediately that the plane struggling towards them wasn't a Wellington. Light the flares, the ops officer shouted. Pale light flickered down the runway from the paraffin flares, and the chance light added its yellow glow. The men on the ground stood frozen in their tracks, their eyes wide with stunned disbelief. The plane coming towards them, lit by the weak glow of the flares, was an ancient, fragile contraption. Frayed fabric flapped, taut wires hummed in the cold wind, and 2 rotted bicycle tires spun on the plane's undercarriage. Tattered canvas surrounded the open cockpit of an FE-2 from the early days of World War I. The stunned ground crew stared at the pilot. In the glow of the lights, they could clearly see the scarf, goggles, and helmet of a World War II flying ace. A World War I, flying ace. The pilot thrust a gloved hand over the side of the cockpit and dropped something. An object plinked onto the tarmac, rolled a few times, then was still. Then the pilot pushed the ancient relic to full power and buzzed out of range of the runway lights. An airman ran over to the object the pilot had dropped and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was a wrench, with a piece of paper wrapped around it. The mechanic unwrapped the paper, and the men crowded around to read the handwriting. Wellington aircraft number 2961 was down, not shot down, over the continent, where the crew would have had a chance to escape or be taken prisoner. The pilot had coaxed the Vickers bomber as far as he could, trying to get back to Mindenhall, but the valiant plane had lost its struggle over water. The bomber had gone down in the sea, 40 miles from the nearest air-sea rescue outfit. The plane and everyone on board was lost. So why did the relic of a bygone era appear in the skies over Mildenhall to deliver the tragic news? In the Second World War, number 149 Squadron flew Vickers Wellingtons out of Mildenhall. And a generation before, British pilots pioneered the air war, flying from the airfields in France. Number 149 Squadron, flying in the First World War, flew Fe-2 biplanes. So there you have it. Spooky. Okay, guys, that's going to do it for today. Again, I still don't know how far we have to go on this book, so it could be really short next week, or it could be a full reading night next week. We will see. So we'll continue this next Sunday, 5 p.m. Pacific, and see where we end up. And like I said, once we do finish this book, I'll go looking for some other books to read, and then we can take a vote on what we want to hear from next. Okay? Anyway, thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. If there were any gifts on TikTok, thank you. I didn't see them. Obviously, I was reading. But I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I will see you all tomorrow night on TikTok at 7 p.m. Pacific, doing some tarot card readings. And we'll just get our week started and all that. And like I said, starting on Monday, January 20th, we will start getting into doing regular radio shows with guests. And I'm excited about that and, getting those scheduled up and everything. All right, TikTok, thank you very much. I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye. And you guys hang on over here. And now, okay. All right. So for you guys, again, we're going to start getting these shows regularly scheduled. So Nancy, of course, will be back on Friday. We're going to continue our discussion about the brain and consciousness. So that'll be going on next Friday. And I might throw in, because I still have to finish off that Lego Christmas tree. I found out with this Lego Christmas tree that there were 3 trees instead of 2 trees that were buildable in the kit. So I just got done with the medium-sized tree last night on the air, and then I have to build the smallest of the trees, and I'm filming footage of that to show everybody. So you'll see all that coming out. Like I said, I hurt my foot, so you're going to be seeing a lot, quite a bit of Christmas stuff coming out in the next week or so. All right. Should TikTok disappear, and so those of you that are over here following me on TikTok, please join us at Clapper. That's where we're going to be. Go sign up, download Clapper. It's safe. It's not TikTok. It's not owned by TikTok, so it's a safe place to be. It's just like TikTok when TikTok was just beginning. Okay, so it's just like TikTok. So you guys should be comfortable over there. So anyway, I will see you, and probably Tuesday I will go live again, and we'll finish off. Maybe these are the Lego tree, but I still have the Peanuts Gingerbread House to finish off. So maybe that's what we'll be doing on Tuesday. And that will be at 5 p.m. Pacific. And then we can get that wrapped up and start swinging into other projects, okay? All right, guys. Thank you so much. I will see you guys on Tuesday, okay? Or join me over at TikTok tomorrow, 7 p.m. Pacific, California Haunts on TikTok or Clapper, okay? See you guys later. Bye.